Over to you. All right, Jerry, I think we are good to go. I think we have it.
All right. Howdy, folks. I'm Jerry Blackroller, trustee at Saratoga County History Center, and I've got the pleasurable assignment of welcoming you to the 12th Experts Next Door presentation and introducing the expert for the program. I rather like these sort of assignments because it allows me to talk about what can be done in the midst of a pandemic when the museum and nearly all of its programs were shuttered. The History Center came up with a Zoom program that allows us to connect the Saratoga County community with top experts in a variety of subjects, such as tonight. Previous themes, and this is the 12th one we've done, include how to make hot chocolate in the 18th century, gardening, immigration, and religion. The Saratoga County History Center mission is to serve as a repository for local histories and to provide innovative educational and public programming, and that's what we're doing this evening. The goal is to help understand how the past informs the present and our future. I urge you to check on our upcoming events, and there are lots of them, by going to our website, brooksidemuseum.org. The historic building that we have will reopen Saturday week, and we are, as you might expect, extremely excited. Our program this evening, as you know since you signed up for it, is New York, Joseph Smith, and the fight for religious freedom. We are fortunate to have that expert on Joseph Smith. Dr. Spencer McBride earned his PhD in history at Louisiana State University. He's an associate managing historian of the Joseph Smith Papers Project and a frequent speaker, writer, and podcaster. His first book, Pulpit and Nation, came out in 2016. His second, Contingent Citizens, Shifting Perspectives of Latter-day Saints in American Political Culture, published last year by Cornell Press. His third book, which just came out last month, is Joseph Smith for President, and I might point out that it is available at Northside Bookstore, both on their website as well as their sales counter. Dr. McBride is indeed the expert for this presentation, and I am most pleased to have had the opportunity to chat with him earlier, introduce him to his audience, and to listen to his presentation. Spencer, welcome to the 12th Experts Next Door. The podium is yours.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And it's good to be with you guys, even if it's virtual. We're getting close. It feels like we're getting so close to being in person again. But in the meantime, I'm grateful to be able to connect with you guys in this way. I'm thankful for the Saratoga County History Center for inviting me, and Northshire Bookstore for carrying the book. Jerry mentioned my new book, Joseph Smith for President. Now, spoiler alert, he doesn't win. In fact, I wrote a book about a failed presidential campaign. And not only that, I wrote a book about a candidate who had no chance of winning. What's more, most Americans today don't even know that Joseph Smith ran for president. So why does this story matter? Why does this history of a little known, long shot presidential campaign matter to Americans in the 21st century? Now, and there's a lot of ways to answer this, but perhaps the most important is that this unlikely presidential campaign becomes an indispensable lens to view the obstacles to universal religious freedom. We're in a country that celebrates its exceptional level of freedom. And if you compare the United States to many other countries, especially at the time of its founding, there are exceptional freedoms in the United States. But sometimes our celebration of what's great about the United States leads us to overlook some of the not so great parts of our history. And we can talk about both, right? We can celebrate what's good, what's great, and still talk about what is not so great. And if it's something that happened in the past, it still matters as we talk this way about our country today. And I'll talk a little bit about Mormonism's New York origins leading up to Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. But I have to tell you all that I found out a connection I had to Saratoga County that I didn't know about until yesterday. I told my dad I was going to be speaking with you all, and I knew I had ancestors in the 1700s who were in Western New York. But little did I know until yesterday that my fifth great grandfather, Daniel McBride, is buried in Saratoga County, New York. And it was after his death that his widow moved their children west to Chautauqua County. And as New York is so famous for in this time period, it's like one of my colleagues calls Albany New York's, the first gateway to the west, right? Before St. Louis, it was Albany leading people into Western New York and then out into the Ohio and further west. And so my family traveled through there. So yeah, that's my personal connection to Saratoga County. But I'm gonna start with, I don't want to bury the lead. So what is the big thing that Joseph Smith's presidential campaign helps us understand? You know, Charles Dickens, if you've ever read A Christmas Carol, he mentions in the very first paragraph, Marley was dead, and this must be distinctly understood if anything wonderful is going to come of this story. Because right, if Marley wasn't dead, it's no big deal that Ebenezer Scrooge's business partner visits him to talk to him in the night. But if you know Marley's dead, it makes all the difference in that story. There's a fact in our constitutional history that was once very well known, but seems to have fallen victim to our collective historical amnesia. And it's this. Prior to the Civil War and the passing of the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states. The Bill of Rights only began to apply to the individual states after the adoption of the 14th Amendment. So when we talk about the protection of religious freedom in the First Amendment, that was designed to protect the people's rights from infringement by the federal government. But what happens when an individual state is the one infringing upon the people's rights? And that is the one thing that needs to be understood. Just like to understand A Christmas Carol, you have to understand that Marley was dead. If anything wonderful is going to come from my remarks about Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, it's that the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states before the Civil War. Okay, and that's where we're going to end up. But let's rewind. New York, 1820s. The Smith family with a young 14-year-old boy named Joseph Smith are part of this Yankee invasion, this mass migration of New Englanders to Western New York after that state is opened up to white settlement following the Revolution. Millions come, roughly 10% of the US population moves into and or through Western New York between 1790 and 1850. This also coincides with the Second Great Awakening, and I'm told that my colleague and friend Jennifer Dorsey talked to you all a few months ago about the Second Great Awakening religious revivals in the West. This is where the Mormon origins come into play. Joseph Smith is living in Palmyra, New York, and he's attending all these different religious meetings. He's concerned about the state of his soul, and he wants to know which of these Protestant churches he should join. He ultimately goes into the woods near his home and prays. And according to his history, how he tells it, he has a vision of deity. And that vision leads to other visions. He's led to, again, according to his history, an ancient record written on golden plates buried nearby, which as he tells it, the gift and power of God, he translates into the Book of Mormon, which becomes a companion to the Bible, another book of scripture that Mormons or Latter-day Saints use. And there in Western New York establishes the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But because of the use of the Book of Mormon, followers are often nicknamed Mormons. Now, the church stays in New York. The church is never entirely gone from New York, but as is so often the case in the middle of the 1800s, New York is this launching pad. People settle there, but then they move further west. And that's what happens with Joseph Smith and the Mormons and the headquarters of the church. They go to Ohio. And then they go to Missouri, and they believe it's in western Missouri that they're going to build the city of Zion, a place where when Jesus Christ returns with the second coming, it will be to Missouri that he returns. And so this is their plan. They want to practice their religion in peace, but things don't go so well in Missouri. Because one thing that the Mormons are doing is they are gathering together. When people convert to Mormonism, most of them move to Missouri. And when you have a small western county and one religious group quickly becomes the majority in that county, the non-Mormons begin to look around and see that they're outnumbered. And they get worried that they're going to lose control of who they elect to political office, that they're going to lose economic control. And this leads them to take matters into their own hands, and they go about it with mob violence. And they essentially discount the Mormons' religion. They call it a pretend religion because they don't want to be seen as persecutors of religious minorities, so they have to discount their faith as not valid. And in Jackson County, Missouri, mobs come upon the Mormons. They destroy their printing press. They burn down some of their houses. They kill some of the men, rape several of the women, and the Mormons are forced to flee to another part of Missouri. And in 1838, it all happens again, but this time it's worse. This time when the Mormons appeal to the governor of Missouri for help, the governor issues an executive order against them. And the executive order says, and I quote, "The Mormons must be exterminated or driven from the state for the public good." Can you imagine today a governor saying that a people, a religious minority, needed to be exterminated? But that is exactly what happened in the 1830s. And so the Mormons are forced to flee in the dead of winter out of Missouri, cross the Mississippi River into Illinois, where they begin to rebuild their lives as religious refugees. And they establish a new city called Nauvoo. Joseph Smith, who leads the church not only as the church's president, but he's seen by his followers as a prophet, in the same way that Moses or Abraham are seen as biblical prophets. That's how Mormons perceive Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was not a naturally political person. I think he really would have been content to just lead his people in peace and in isolation. But clearly that wasn't possible. They had millions of dollars of property taken from them in Missouri. And so Joseph Smith sees no other option. He has to go to Washington, D.C. to get help from Congress. And his first stop in Washington, D.C. is the White House. And these are the days where you could knock on the White House door. Now, you needed like a congressman or someone respectable to introduce you. But essentially, Joseph Smith and his congressman from Illinois go and they knock on the White House door one afternoon and they are let in. And Martin Van Buren would hold afternoon receptions almost every day of the week to hear from people that wanted to talk to the president. Could you even imagine that happening today? You can't even get to the White House door to knock, let alone knock on it, right? Like you would be probably shot or attacked or tackled the moment you even tried to scale the fence. And this isn't me recommending anyone try. Please don't try. Saying some speaker came and said we should try to knock on the White House door. Don't do that. And Joseph Smith meets with Martin Van Buren. And Martin Van Buren doesn't express any prejudice against the Mormons. He doesn't express any bigotry, but he says, "What can I do? If I help you, I will lose the vote in Missouri." So Van Buren is up for re-election. And he knows that if he speaks out in favor of the Mormons, he's going to lose the vote in Missouri. So Joseph Smith goes on to Congress, and the Senate holds a committee hearing, the Senate Judiciary Committee, not to determine whether or not to give the Mormons reparations, but whether Congress can even do anything in this case. And so here's this reluctant, this American prophet, reluctant to be involved with government, standing in the halls of Congress. And Congress decides there is nothing we can do. The federal government has no jurisdiction. And this shatters Joseph Smith's American idealism. He says essentially that he loves his country, but there's something wrong If a state can force a religious minority out under threat of state-sanctioned extermination, and the federal government says we can do nothing because of states' rights. He's saying there's something wrong there. And from that moment in 1839 and 1840, when Joseph Smith goes to Washington, I'm telling you, I should make a movie called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, unless that title's already taken. But okay, so bad joke. It won't be my last, but I apologize for it now. I'll apologize for my bad jokes that I tell later too. But essentially, Joseph Smith has this idealism shattered. He realizes he still loves his country, but there's something wrong. We need reform. We need to reform the Constitution so that this can't happen. Joseph Smith was not a great political thinker. He was not one of the great legal minds of American history, but his lived experience as the leader of a minority religious group said, there's something wrong that the Bill of Rights does not apply to the individual states. So here he is almost by accident on the vanguard of those calling for the Bill of Rights to apply to the individual states. And he petitions Congress every single year. In 1843, the Mormons have built up the city of Nauvoo. It's the largest state in Illinois, even larger than Chicago. And some of the same issues that happened in Missouri are beginning to rear their heads again in Illinois. Non-Mormons are worried that the Mormons have too much power, too much political and economic power. It's concentrated. They're afraid. And so there begin to be threats of mob violence again. And Joseph Smith says, we need to protect ourselves. In November of 1843, Joseph Smith writes to the 5 men expected to run for president: John C. Calhoun, Lewis Cass, Henry Clay, who wanted to be president more than anybody has ever wanted to be president in the history of the United States, Richard Mentor Johnson, and Martin Van Buren. And the letter is the same to all 5, saying, if you're elected, what will you do to help us, help protect our rights? The Mormons are a minority, but in Illinois, which is evenly split between Whigs and Democrats, what essentially the Mormons are offering is, if you come out and promise to protect our rights, you will win the state of Illinois. Because the Mormons are the kingmaker. They hold the balance between the Whigs and the Democrats. Whoever they vote for will win Illinois and its electoral votes. Martin Van Buren and his former vice president, Richard Mentor Johnson, they don't respond. He kind of knew what Van Buren thought already. Joseph Smith was really ticked off by what Lewis Cass and John C. Calhoun being Mr. States' Rights himself, they essentially write back and say, we sympathize with your condition, but states' rights tells us that the federal government should do nothing. And that really irked Joseph Smith. And he writes back and says, the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs. The states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs. But what irritated Joseph Smith more than John C. Calhoun's response was Henry Clay's response. Because John C. Calhoun at least took a principled response, right? He said, my answer is based on this principle. Now, Joseph Smith didn't like that principle, but at least Calhoun had a principle. Henry Clay gave the most politician answer ever, essentially saying, I sympathize, I'm sorry, I would love your votes. I'm not going to promise anything because I don't want to go into office having to do anything that I said I would do on the campaign trail. But yeah, you guys should vote for me anyway. Essentially, Henry Clay played the politician. And I think that irritated Joseph Smith even more than what Calhoun wrote. And so in January 1844, the Mormons realize they're desperate. Things are getting bad. They worry they're going to be expelled or exterminated. Joseph Smith runs for president in January 1844, announces his candidacy. It's a long shot to run outside of the two-party system. No one's ever done it. No one was going to do it in 1844. But it was an act of desperation. It was a public relations move. By running for president, it would bring national attention onto the plight of this religious minority in the country. But he also hoped that if there was divine intervention, he might actually win. Joseph Smith issues a campaign pamphlet and they print thousands of copies. And one issue drove him into the presidential race. That was a strong federal government empowered to protect minority groups when the states failed to do so. But he wasn't a one-issue candidate. He called for the immediate abolition of slavery and offered a really pragmatic solution. The federal government was selling all this land in the West. Joseph Smith said, let's take those proceeds and let's buy the freedom of the slaves in the South. Paid emancipation in a large scale led by the federal government. Now, this had been happening on a small scale. There were many Quakers who would buy an enslaved man or woman's freedom, one or two at a time. But what Joseph Smith was proposing was government-sponsored total emancipation by buying the freedom of enslaved men and women. He called for massive criminal justice reform. Smith had been imprisoned under false pretenses. His father had been in debtor's prison. Joseph Smith realized that the criminal justice system wasn't reforming men convicted of crimes, but was creating a permanent criminal class. So Joseph said these penitentiaries that were rising up, these prisons, we need to close them, turn them into schools, essentially saying and this is in the 1840s. He's already saying we're spending too much money on prisons, not enough money on schools. He calls for banking reform. And this was a long-standing issue in American politics. Do you have a national bank? Without a national bank, the country was going through an endless cycle of booms and busts. There were great times when the getting was good, and then there were horrible times. Joseph Smith proposes a new national bank, but different than the previous ones, because no one would get rich. You would pay the men that led the bank $2 a day. That's it. And their goal was to run a public organization that served the public by regulating the economy. There'd be no investors. There'd be no one getting rich off a public institution. And he also called for the annexation of Texas, taking all of the Oregon country and expanding the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean and even into Canada and New Mexico if practical. So Joseph Smith had this robust campaign, and he printed in a pamphlet called General Smith's Views on the Policies and Power of the Federal Government. And they print thousands of copies. Now, Joseph Smith, this was a long shot presidential bid. He was serious about it, but he was realistic about his expectations. But Joseph Smith had something that no other third-party candidate at that time could have dreamed of. Joseph Smith had a core of experienced missionaries, men that had gone throughout the country and even internationally preaching religion. And he deployed them as campaigners. Go out and campaign. Now, some of them loved this. They loved preaching politics. Others didn't feel so comfortable and they just went back to preaching religion. But they said, hey, if we convert someone to Mormonism, they're going to vote for Joseph Smith. So preaching religion's like preaching politics. So Joseph Smith sent over 400 electioneering missionaries throughout the country, armed with this pamphlet to get votes for his presidential campaign. A lot go to New York because the church's origins in New York meant that a lot had friends and family in New York. It's in New York City that the Mormons set up a campaign newspaper called The Prophet. Because if you publish campaign literature in a newspaper, this is a time when other newspapers throughout the country were desperate for content. And if they saw something interesting in one paper, they would just reprint it. So the Mormons were very savvy about how they went about this campaign. And they established a newspaper on Printers Row in Lower Manhattan. If you know where Pace University is in Manhattan now, that was Printers Row. And that's where the Mormons had their newspaper. Okay, and totally fun fact and tangent, the guy who ran the Mormons newspaper was named Sam Brannan. And maybe you know that name because Sam Brannan, once the Mormons go west to Utah, as you know, he led a group on a boat from New York around Cape Horn to San Francisco with the plan of joining them in Utah. But Sam Brannan never does. He stays in San Francisco. And that printing press that he used to print Joseph Smith's campaign newspaper was the very press that first printed word that gold had been discovered in California in 1848. Okay, that's a total tangent, but kind of like your fun fact. You're gonna like really either wow people at your next dinner party or really bore them. I'll let you be the judge of that. But hey, we're almost to the point where we can have dinner parties again. So I got to kind of get you loaded up on your fun historical facts. I don't get invited to many. Maybe it's because of my Sam Brannan facts. No, I'm just kidding about that. Okay, so one of the problems that these electionarian missionaries had was in the South, because many of the Southern states had laws against distributing abolitionist literature. And Joseph Smith's campaign platform, his pamphlet, called for the end of slavery. And there were missionaries who were surrounded by mobs, not because they were Mormons, but because they were in Tennessee calling for the end of slavery. Another interesting dimension of this campaign. So Joseph Smith and they're canvassing the country. They have conventions in every state to select electors, these nominating conventions. But then in June 1844, there's dissent in Nauvoo, Illinois, and some men that were once Mormons that had broken away published an anti-Mormon newspaper in the city. Joseph Smith, in his capacity as mayor and in conjunction with the city council, ordered its destruction. It was a move that would ultimately lead to Joseph Smith's arrest. And while he was imprisoned, his enemies, who had been looking for their opportunity to take care of Joseph Smith, to get him out of the picture, seized their opportunity. They stormed the jail and they murdered Joseph Smith. This makes Joseph Smith the first assassinated presidential candidate in American history. Now, the asterisk next to that is he was not assassinated because he was running for president. The mob wasn't trying to stop him from becoming president. They knew he wasn't going to win. But being killed in the midst of his presidential campaign gives Joseph Smith that distinction. It's a distinction no one wants, but it's Joseph Smith's nonetheless. Ultimately, then, in the wake of Joseph Smith's assassination, the Mormons move west. The majority of the Mormons follow Brigham Young, who's Joseph Smith's successor, and they go to Utah. But remember at the very beginning when I said the one thing we absolutely have to understand is that the Bill of Rights did not apply to the individual states, and that for Joseph Smith, the states' rights doctrine was what fed mobs. Now, on the surface, the states' rights doctrine has nothing to do with religion. You can read this idea and think this has no negative effect on religion. But what Joseph Smith and others were saying is that the implementation of this policy had a discriminatory effect. That's what he was talking about when he talked about systemic bigotry. That we need to look at the laws that on the surface are not bigoted, that are not prejudiced, but in their implementation have a discriminatory effect. And Joseph Smith was saying there's something wrong if a state can expel some of its citizens under threat of extermination, and the federal government can do nothing. The states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs. Okay, so was he right? Let me, in closing, offer one startling quote from 1854 that suggests that he was. So David Atchison in the 1830s had been one of the Missouri militiamen who, under the order of the governor, had expelled the Mormons from Missouri. They had beat and even killed Mormon men, raped Mormon women, burned Mormon homes, and they'd gotten away with it. In 1854, that same David Atchison was a sitting US senator from Missouri. And in 1854, Missouri's dealing with another unwanted political minority, the abolitionists. The abolitionists that are flooding to Kansas are also coming into Missouri. Missouri's a slave state, and they're figuring out, what do we do with this unwanted minority group, in this case, a political minority. Senator Atchison writes to Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, and this is what he says about how they're going to handle this unwanted political minority. We are organizing to meet their organization. We will be compelled to shoot, burn, and hang, but the thing will soon be over. We intend to Mormonize the abolitionist. Senator Atchison turned Mormon into a verb for violently persecuting and expelling an unwanted minority group. Joseph Smith said the states' rights doctrines are what feed mobs, that if the federal government, he's not calling for a federal government that's all powerful, but when states fail to protect minority groups, or when states are the persecutor of minority groups, the federal government should be empowered to help. And this is an example that suggests that maybe Smith was right. Missouri had expelled the Mormons under threat of extermination, and they got away with it. In 1854, they did it again. And that's why Joseph Smith ran for president. He saw something in his country that he loved, that he wanted to preserve. He wanted his citizenship rights for himself and for his followers. But he said, there's something wrong with our Constitution if this is allowed. And so the book, Joseph Smith for President, I think Mormons will read it because they're interested in Joseph Smith, but others might see it and they might have zero interest in Joseph Smith and his religious teachings. But hopefully, and the way I tried to present it in the book, is why this story matters, even if you normally wouldn't care about Joseph Smith. What does this tell us today about how we try to fight bigotry of all kinds? Because there's many of us who in our interpersonal interactions, we would never treat a member of a minority group, religious, racial, or otherwise, any differently than we would people who are like us. But maybe we unwittingly support policies that on the surface have nothing to do with prejudice, but in their implementation have a prejudiced effect, have a discriminatory effect. And so it's up for each one of us in a constitutional republic, in a democracy, to be thoughtful about our laws and our policies, and not just how they affect us, but how they affect others. And I think Joseph Smith's story speaks to that. It's a fascinating story. It's quixotic. When a mayor of a small town or a small burgeoning city in Illinois runs for president and tries to compete with the likes of John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay and Martin Van Buren, there's something quixotic and fun about that. But I hope also a lesson that makes us think and reflect on our history. Again, there is a lot to like and to celebrate in the history of the United States. But if we're responsible in our study of the past, we also have to be willing to think about the not so great parts and to take those alongside, not to push one aside for the other, but to take them both together. And I hope that this book and also our conversation tonight, helps illustrate that. And I look forward to your questions and comments. And if you have even worse jokes or more obscure fun facts about this, I'd love to hear those too. So that's where I'll close, and look forward to us talking and chatting. So Jerry, I don't know, how do people just call out or?
Especially if you look out, you're going to get barraged with some questions. I haven't seen any chats going on, but maybe I haven't followed them. But if somebody's got a question, Ann can moderate that and get that question to you.
Okay.
I mean, I'm thanking you for an insight that I just simply did not have about states' rights in the early 19th century. I missed that day in the lecture.
Well, but I think a lot of us did. I didn't learn that until college, and there are things like that, right? That are part of our kind of collective historical amnesia, as I might call it. That it's sometimes it's willfully forgotten, and sometimes it's just something that we don't talk about long enough, and then we forget.
Yep.
I see a hand raised, the person labeled Mark. If you want to unmute and go ahead and ask your question, please go ahead.
Unmute. Okay, am I unmuted?
We can hear you now, yes.
Excellent. All right, my question for Spencer is there are two questions. first of all, are you of Latter-day Saints religion? And second of all, how far into the campaign was it? How far did he get before he was assassinated or killed?
Yeah, great questions. Yes, I am a practicing Latter-day Saint. My parents are actually converts. But yeah, so I work at the Joseph Smith Papers Project. And then so I'm glad you asked that because, right, we have to explain kind of our background. And when I write about this, I try to write about it as objectively as possible.
Mhm.
And as we know, that's never entirely possible. We can never free ourselves entirely from our biases. We see things, the present and the past, through the lens of our experience. But yes, I am a practicing Latter-day Saint. Joseph Smith died in June 1844. The election was going to be held in November 1844.
So
So
it's
he was
rather
several
early.
months in. Yeah, and it would have been interesting to see what would have happened on election day. Again, he wasn't going to win.
Right.
But there was another third party candidate named James G. Birney, who was running with the Liberty Party. And they had one issue, and that was the abolition of slavery. And Birney wasn't going to win. But the threat that these third party candidates, one of the things they hope is that maybe that in running, they can influence the platform of one of the major parties, one direction or another. And we see that. Ross Perot did that, for instance, when he ran as a third party candidate. He influenced the Republican platform. But James G. Birney, what he did is he took enough votes away from Henry Clay that Henry Clay lost the state of New York. And because Henry Clay lost the state of New York, James K. Polk won the presidency.
Interesting.
So sometimes third party candidates are the wild cards that they're not going to win, but they can keep someone else from winning. And so it would have been interesting to see what would have happened. Joseph Smith would have got the most votes of any of the places he was on the ballot in Illinois. He probably would have gotten some in a smattering in Massachusetts, New York, and a few other states. But he was never in serious contention.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks for that question.
It looks like there is a chat or question in the chat from Don Halgren asking, so what prompted the separation of the Bill of Rights from states / the Republic?
Yeah, great question. So if we go back to how this concept of the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the individual states, it's the Revolutionary era. In the wake of the Revolution, as Americans are founding the Constitution or adopting a constitution, the question of who is best equipped to protect the rights of the people is an open question. And in the aftermath of a revolution that was fought over a distant parliament, controlling things in the colonies without representation, the idea is that the closer a government is to the people, the better equipped they are to protect their rights. So the idea was the states are the best source of protection of the people's rights. And then the Bill of Rights was adopted to guarantee that the people's rights wouldn't be infringed upon by the federal government. What Joseph Smith and others were arguing was essentially that sometimes states aren't protecting those rights, and other times states are the ones that are actually infringing upon those rights. And in those instances, the federal government needs to be empowered to step in. So I think Joseph Smith was okay with the idea of the states still being kind of the first line of defense, but there needed to be a backup in the event that a state either failed to protect those rights or the state was the aggressor. But yeah, that's kind of the thinking, and it makes perfect sense coming out of the American Revolution why that strain of thinking was in place. It took the lived experience of Joseph Smith and other minority groups to say, hey, hold on, there's something wrong here. We need to just kind of tweak the system of it. Great question. I hope I answered that. If not, send me a follow-up and I'll do better.
It looks like we have a hand raised from the one labeled Hudson, New York. So feel free to unmute yourselves and jump in and ask.
All right, awesome. So we were actually wondering, how would you think America would look today if by some miraculous way, Joseph Smith was able to win the election?
Yeah, so that's a big what if question. I think it's a fun one to think about. So I would say what we see about Joseph, if I had to characterize Joseph Smith's political views, his were a politics of compassion. Every issue he talked about was relevant nationally, but there was compassion in his politics. Yes, people that committed crimes needed to face punishment, but it should be less punitive and more about reform. Let's reform criminals rather than punishing them in a way that they can't re-enter society and be productive citizens. Let's reform, let's end slavery. In fact, the very first paragraph of his presidential pamphlet says, there's something wrong when we celebrate that all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence, and then, but 2 or 3 million men, women, and children are enslaved because the color of the skin that covers their souls, that's how he phrased it, is different than ours. Banking reform. Let's have a banking system that doesn't just help the rich get richer, but that helps anyone who wants to make a go of it in the United States have a fighting chance to do it, right? These are the politics of compassion. Now, people might disagree with his specific policies. I read his pamphlet and say, that's a great idea. I mean, have you guys ever heard a politician on the trail and he or she spouts some really lofty ideals, but then it's like, yeah, good luck finding a way to get that, actually making that happen. I'm not sure how many of these policies were practical, could have been successful, but what they reveal is a compassion for the plight of the marginalized. Let's find a way to make the country, to make the Constitution work for all Americans and not just some. And so if, you know, miracle of miracles, Joseph Smith had won the presidency, yeah, I think you would have seen him attempt to institute these policies. But the reality of the situation is he would be a president from a party of one trying to work with the Whigs and Democrats in divided government. And that's not all that different than today. I think we can all kind of understand the workings or lack of workings of divided government. So great question. I hope that was a good enough answer, but it's really a fun, you know, some of these what if questions can be fun. Thank you.
Another question.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Did he get as far as developing some type of platform?
Yeah. So he published a pamphlet within 3 weeks of declaring his candidacy. He published a pamphlet called General Smith's Views on the, and he went by, that was his local militia title. And it was common in the 19th century that if you had a militia title, that's how people addressed you. So he went by General Smith. General Smith's Views on the Powers and Policy of the United States Government. And it was about 11 pages. And they printed thousands and thousands of copies, sent it to every member of Congress, every member of the Supreme Court, the whole presidential cabinet, and those missionaries carried it around, those electionary missionaries. Instead of religious tracts, they were handing out copies of his campaign platform.
Where was his stance on women's voting rights?
Yeah, you know, he doesn't say anything about that.
Of course not.
And you know what? The interesting thing is there were people calling for it then, but we were about 4 years away from the Seneca Falls Convention, which is a watershed moment in that process. But yeah, he's silent on that issue.
Thank you.
All right, it looks like we have another hand raised. I'm sorry about if I get the name wrong, Chile Brooks. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask.
Sure, that's me, Chile. So I'm curious about the lasting impact of his political views. I mean, obviously he didn't win the presidency, but who was listening and who carried some of his ideas and ideals forward? Like, how did it affect the governance of the community where he lived after he died? Did they carry some of those same political ideals forward as they moved and settled in Utah? So I guess, you know, just after the fact, what happened?
Yeah, great question. So no one really picks up the mantle of trying to run for political office, at least in Illinois. And the Mormons are just trying to survive and ultimately escape the United States. They're going to Utah. Their goal is to leave the United States. They believe that the United States has failed them. When they leave Illinois following Brigham Young, they think they're leaving the United States. Irony of ironies, by the time they get to the Great Salt Lake, the Mexican-American War is happening, and that territory is now part of the United States. So they were trying to leave, and they end up right back in the country. You do see Brigham Young and others with some of these same ideas of compassionate politics. You see some prison reform movements. It's hard to trace anyone that's back east tracing their ideas to Joseph Smith, but there's one question I have that I haven't answered yet that may be related to your question. So in May 1844, 1 month before he's assassinated, Charles Francis Adams, from that Adams family, right, John Quincy Adams' son, and Josiah Quincy, the future mayor of Boston, whose father was the president of Harvard, they are on this great Western sightseeing tour, and they stop in Nauvoo, and they spend an entire day with Joseph Smith. Oh. Charles Francis Adams, among others, would argue for a system of paid emancipation later on in his life. Whether or not this is inspired by Joseph Smith, I can't prove, right? I can't draw the definitive line saying this idea was inspired by Joseph Smith. But you do see this idea of paid emancipation. That's how we end slavery, being spoken of more in the 1850s. I just can't say for certain this was Joseph Smith's idea lingering on. But yeah, you do see some of that. And Joseph Smith's views, he offered some really unique solutions, but these were all questions that were open questions. And so you'll see echoes of his positions throughout American politics. It's just sometimes hard when you see words bouncing all over the place to trace them back to their origins, right? Who's the originator of these ideas? What's interesting though is Brigham Young in Utah, they're now a US territory, and they continue to publish every now and then Joseph Smith's views, his pamphlet, and distribute it. There continues to be this lasting interest in what he thought politically, and that doesn't go away in the Mormon community.
Well, and to the point of the woman who talked about women and the vote, I know that Utah allowed women to vote a long time before that was allowed anywhere else. And then that right was taken away for a period of time, but I know there were women voting a long time before most other places.
So it's funny. Great point, because the first American women to vote were actually in New Jersey. There was a loophole after the Revolution that just said all property owners, and there were 2 or 3 women who owned property. And so it was a loophole. They voted, and then New Jersey quickly closed that loophole. Wyoming territory was the first territory to allow women to vote. Utah territory actually cast their ballots 1 week before Wyoming. So Utah women were the first women to vote in the American Republic legally. And but when they obtained statehood for Utah, they had to give that right up. Yeah, great point. And I see a question here in the chat.
You're fine.
What changed over time with the Mormons' attitude and practices regarding race and ability for Black Americans to be involved in the church? Great question. So Joseph Smith, like many other Americans, was very much a product of his time. He claimed to be a prophet, and that shows, but he also still was a man born in his time and place. But his views on race progressed over time. And the later in his life, we see whenever he spoke about it and wrote about it, by the end of his life, he has a very progressive view on race. Joseph Smith ordained a few Black men to the Mormon priesthood. He also allowed Black men to own property in Nauvoo, his city in Illinois. And in fact, women could own property in Illinois as well. Brigham Young goes west, leading the majority of the Mormons with him, and there some more restrictive policies are put in place about the ordination of Black men to the priesthood. So in the Mormon church, the priesthood is exclusively male, which in the 1850s was very common. But they also put in restrictions about race and who could hold the priesthood. This existed in any number of Christian churches at the time. However, the Mormon restriction continued later than most churches and wasn't ended until 1978. So in 1978, that's when the restriction on Black men that prevented them from being ordained was lifted. And so, yeah, we see sometimes when we talk about race, whether it's the Mormon church or just the United States in general, we often think of it as like a progressive chart, right? Like it's getting better and better and better. The reality is it's more waves. You know, we do better in one area, we do worse in another area. You take 5 giant steps forward and we take a few steps back. And the Mormons as a group are no different than that. There's progression on issues of race, but often it's too slow for many people and sometimes not enough. So yeah, like any religious group of that time, and even moving into the 20th century, race was this sticky issue that often threatened to divide the church. So yeah, fantastic question. I hope I answered it adequately. If not, follow up and I'll do better.
Question.
Yes.
Does any other state teach Smith's philosophy other than Utah? Considering today that we're opening up history to all kinds of things that have been put under the table, so to speak, over the last 200 years. It would seem to me that the Smith philosophy would be something that should be taught more in schools as a part of American history.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And one of the reasons I wrote the book, right? I mean, a question like that's just music to an author's ear as he's hoping people, will be interested in his book. So even in Utah, Joseph Smith's presidential campaign has kind of been relegated to like the fun fact category. Just like I told you, Sam Brannan printed Joseph Smith's campaign newspaper on the same printing press he printed the gold rush. That's cool. Not all that useful. And so there's lots of people, especially a lot of Mormons, who know that Joseph Smith ran for president. They can't tell you why. They can't tell you the context. They can't tell you what he was trying to do. And so I wrote the book really with 2 audiences in mind. First, the general audience. Why does this story matter? Why do people that maybe don't care about Joseph Smith and as a religious leader, why should they care about his long shot quixotic presidential campaign? But also for Latter-day Saints, many of whom are in Utah, but they're worldwide. Here's this story that's a big part of their history that's almost forgotten, almost just become trivia. Why should you know? Now, I'm not saying that, someone should take Joseph Smith's political ideas and assume that they're doctrine, right? The way you'd follow, theological teachings. But maybe they give us, I think it's the compassion of his politics is something that we can seek to emulate. How do we deal with political differences? Because Joseph Smith didn't agree with everyone, and everyone in the Mormon church didn't agree on their political questions. But can you disagree and still be civil about it? Can we analyze our own views and realize, hey, maybe I can see things that I'm not meaning to be prejudiced against somebody, but maybe I am supporting policies and laws that have a discriminatory effect. Am I secure enough and vulnerable enough to interrogate my own views, my own positions, and rethink some things? I think those are good in any republic, in any democracy, for a citizenry to be willing and able to do that. But yeah, I wrote the book hoping that it can start a lot of these conversations, make people think differently. You never know, though. Authors try to do something with their book, and you just hope somebody reads it and let them do with it what they will.
All right.
right, do we have anyone else with any other questions or anything that anyone wants to follow up with, or any other further comments? I do want to mention one quick thing. I couldn't resist. I went and looked for Daniel McBride to figure out where in Saratoga County he was buried. And looks like he was initially buried in the Bemis Heights Cemetery, and the gravesite was later moved to Stillwater Union Cemetery. And he was born in 1779 and died the 24th of April, 1805. So I found a little bit of information about your ancestor that you mentioned. So.
Well, thank you so much. And when I can finally make it out there, I can't wait to go see the History Center, and I'll also, you know, go find his gravesite now, because that is, I'm so flattered that you would look that up. I didn't even know about this connection till yesterday.
Well, anyone who knows me knows that I couldn't resist, and I do enjoy cemeteries very much, but it does look like the gravestone is still in existence, and so in the older section of that Stillwater Union Cemetery. So
that gives me all the more motivation to head out there.
Wow, thanks, Spencer. I envy your talents of taking something complicating, spreading it out, and making it palatable as an answer. That's a great talent.
Well, thank you.
You did a great job, and you just were a good expert for us today, and we appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Oh,
Thank
my
you.
pleasure. Thank you all for joining.
all right, so I think we're pretty well set this evening. And again, thank you everyone for being here. And so keep in mind our future and upcoming events, and be sure to check Facebook and our website and for more information about future Experts Next Door. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Good night.